Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I grew up in Burlington, Vermont, in a house my parents purchased in 1996 when I was 6 years old. The property sat on the edge of town, where suburban lawns gave way to dense forest. My parents chose the location specifically for the expansive backyard, nearly 3/4 of an acre of mature maple and birch trees, with a small stream meandering along the rear boundary. The previous owners had constructed a treehouse between two towering maples near the back fence. When we moved in, the structure was weathered and unsafe, but my father saw potential. He spent the entire first summer rebuilding it from the ground up, reinforcing the platform, installing proper walls, and adding a sturdy shingled roof. The finished product stood 15 feet above the ground, accessed by a wooden ladder he'd bolted securely to the larger maple. From the treehouse windows, really just square openings cut into the plywood walls, you could survey the entire backyard, the babbling creek, and the vast wilderness preserve that stretched for miles beyond our property line. The isolation was both thrilling and unnerving for a child. Our nearest neighbor lived a quarter-mile away, and on quiet evenings, the only sounds were wind through branches and water flowing over stones. By age 8, I practically lived in that treehouse during summer months. My mother would pack me sandwiches and juice boxes, and I'd spend entire days up there, reading comic books, building with Legos, or simply watching the wildlife that frequented our yard. Deer would emerge from the forest to drink from the stream. Raccoons would waddle through in the early evening. Once, I spotted a black bear lumber past, though when I told my parents, they suggested it might have been a large dog. The treehouse became my sanctuary, my private kingdom above the world. Looking back now, I realize how vulnerable I was up there. A small child, alone and elevated, visible to anyone who might be watching from the woods. But at 8 years old, I felt invincible in my wooden fortress, completely unaware that something in those dark trees was beginning to take notice of my daily routines. The summer I turned 10 in 1999, my best friend was a boy named Connor Mitchell. He lived on the other side of our neighborhood and had been dealing with his parents' increasingly bitter divorce. His mother worked double shifts at the hospital, and his father had moved to an apartment across town, so Connor spent most days at our house. My parents welcomed him warmly, understanding that he needed stability during such a chaotic time in his young life. Connor and I were inseparable that summer. We'd established elaborate games and rituals in the treehouse. Sometimes we were Arctic explorers trapped in an ice station. Other times we were submarine commanders in the depths of the ocean. We'd haul up supplies for entire days, comic books, Connor's portable radio, bags of chips, and thermoses of lemonade. My mother would call us down for meals, but otherwise we were left to our own devices. The first sign that something was wrong came during the third week of July. Connor and I were in the treehouse around 6 in the evening, engaged in a heated debate about which X-Men character was the strongest, when we heard something large moving through the underbrush near the stream. At first, we assumed it was another deer. They were common in the area and often came to drink in the early evening. But this sounded different. Instead of the light, careful steps of a deer, we heard heavy, deliberate movement. Branches were being pushed aside rather than carefully navigated around. The sound was methodical, purposeful, as if whatever was moving was searching for something specific. Connor and I pressed our faces to the window, trying to get a glimpse of what was making the noise. The setting sun created long shadows across the yard, making it difficult to distinguish shapes. We could see the tops of bushes swaying near the creek, but the source of the movement remained hidden. Then, abruptly, the sound stopped. The forest became unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects. Even the creek seemed to flow more quietly. Connor whispered that maybe we should go inside, but something kept us frozen at the window. After several minutes of silence, we heard something that made both of us step back from the window. It was a sound I'd never heard before and couldn't easily describe. A rhythmic clicking, like someone rapidly tapping two stones together, but with an organic quality that suggested it wasn't being made by an animal or human. The clicking continued for perhaps 30 seconds, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. We waited another hour in the treehouse, speaking in whispers, before finally climbing down and running to the house. That night, I lay in bed replaying the sounds in my mind, trying to convince myself it had been a woodpecker or some other common bird. But deep down, I knew I'd never heard any bird make those clicking sounds. 2 weeks later, Connor and I finally convinced my parents to let us sleep overnight in the treehouse. We'd been begging all summer, and they relented on the condition that we'd come inside if we got scared, or if weather threatened. My father strung up a battery-powered lantern and made us promise to check in every hour until bedtime. We prepared for the adventure like we were embarking on a polar expedition. We hauled up sleeping bags, pillows, a cooler full of sodas and snacks, and a bag of books and games. As darkness fell, we settled into our sleeping bags and began telling ghost stories, the lantern casting dancing shadows on the plywood walls. Around 10:30, we heard our neighbor's dog, Rusty, an aging golden retriever who lived in the house closest to ours, begin barking frantically. Rusty was typically a quiet dog, content to sleep on his owner's porch, so his aggressive barking immediately caught our attention. Connor and I paused our storytelling to listen. The barking continued for several minutes, growing more desperate and fearful. Then, without warning, it stopped mid-bark, as if Rusty had been suddenly silenced. Connor and I looked at each other in the lantern light, both thinking the same terrible thought. What could make a dog stop barking so abruptly? We turned off the lantern and peered out the window toward Rusty's house. Their motion-activated security light was flickering on and off repeatedly, creating a strobing effect across their backyard. In the intermittent illumination, we could see Rusty's doghouse, but no sign of the animal himself. Then we heard footsteps in our own yard. Not the soft padding of an animal, but the deliberate placement of feet moving through grass. The steps were accompanied by that same clicking sound we'd heard weeks earlier. But closer now, much closer. The footsteps seemed to circle the base of our tree, sometimes stopping directly below us. Connor grabbed my arm so tightly it hurt, but I didn't pull away. We sat motionless, afraid that any sound might draw attention to our hiding spot. Through the floorboards, we could hear someone, or something, moving around the base of the tree. The footsteps were too heavy to be made by any local wildlife, too deliberate to be random. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, the sounds faded toward the creek. We waited another hour before Connor whispered that we should make a run for the house. I told him we should wait until dawn. Whatever was out there might still be nearby. He didn't argue. We spent the rest of the night taking turns keeping watch, listening for any sound that might indicate the return of our uninvited visitor. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made us jump. When morning finally arrived, we packed up quickly and climbed down, both of us eager to reach the safety of the house. The next day, while Connor was visiting his father, I gathered enough courage to investigate the area around the treehouse. In the soft earth near the stream, I found footprints that made my stomach turn. They were human in shape, but wrong in proportion. Too long, too narrow, with what appeared to be unusually long toes. The prints were deep, suggesting someone much heavier than a child, and they formed a clear path from the forest to our treehouse and back. I wanted to show the prints to my parents, but I knew they'd ask questions I couldn't answer. How could I explain that Connor and I had been too terrified to come down from the treehouse? How could I describe the clicking sounds and the circling footsteps without sounding like I was making up stories? Instead, I tried to fill in the prints with my shoe, but they were too large and too deep. The disturbed earth remained visible, a reminder that something had been in our yard, something that walked upright but wasn't quite human in its proportions. Over the following weeks, strange incidents multiplied. Our garbage cans were repeatedly overturned, but unlike typical animal intrusions, the contents weren't scattered randomly. Instead, items were arranged in neat piles, as if someone had been methodically searching through them. Food items were left untouched, while papers and other materials were sorted into organized stacks. My mother's garden decorations began disappearing and reappearing in different locations. A ceramic owl that usually sat on our porch railing was found placed carefully on a fence post near the woods. A decorative wind chime was moved from the front yard to a tree branch near the creek. When my mother asked if I'd been rearranging things, I denied it, but I could see she was puzzled by the systematic nature of the relocations. Most disturbing was the smell that began appearing in our yard during evening hours. It was a thick, musky odor unlike anything I'd encountered. Not quite animal, not quite human, but organic and wrong. The smell would hang in the air for 10 or 15 minutes, then dissipate completely, leaving no trace. My parents occasionally noticed it, but attributed it to a passing skunk or some other wildlife. Connor and I avoided the treehouse for several days, but eventually returned during bright daylight hours. We'd convinced ourselves that we'd been overreacting, that the mysterious visitor had been nothing more than a vagrant passing through the area. But we made sure to leave well before sunset, and we never spent another night up there. 3 weeks after our frightening sleepover, Connor was staying at my house again. We'd spent the evening playing video games in my room, which faced the backyard and offered a clear view of the treehouse and forest beyond. It was past midnight when something struck my bedroom window. Not hard, just a light tapping sound like small pebbles being thrown against the glass. We paused our game and listened. Another tap, then another, with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. My bedroom was on the second floor, making it impossible for someone to reach the window without a ladder, or by climbing the large oak tree that grew near the house. Connor suggested it might be moths attracted to the light from my room, but the tapping was too purposeful, too controlled. We crept to the window and peered out carefully, staying low to avoid being seen. The moon was nearly full, casting pale light across the backyard and making the treehouse visible as a dark silhouette against the trees. At first, everything appeared normal, but then Connor gripped my shoulder and pointed toward the forest edge. Something was moving between the trees, a tall, thin figure that seemed to flow rather than walk. It was difficult to make out details in the moonlight, but its proportions were disturbing. The torso was too long, the arms too lengthy, and it moved with an unnatural fluidity that suggested joints that bent in ways human joints shouldn't. As we watched in horror, the figure approached the oak tree that supported our treehouse. Instead of using the ladder, it began climbing the trunk itself, moving with spider-like agility. Its elongated arms reached impossibly far, pulling its body upward in quick, jerky movements. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the treehouse structure. Connor and I backed away from the window, our hearts hammering. Connor whispered frantically, asking what we should do, whether we should wake my parents. But I knew that adults would demand explanations we couldn't provide. We were 10-year-old boys claiming to see something that defied logical explanation. We'd be told we were having nightmares or letting our imaginations run wild. So we huddled on my bed, staring out the window, waiting for whatever was in the treehouse to show itself again. The wait was agonizing. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound seemed magnified. After what felt like hours, we saw the figure emerge from the treehouse, but this time it climbed down the far side of the tree, keeping the trunk between itself and our house. It moved across the yard with that same fluid, unnatural gait, stopping once to look directly up at my bedroom window. In the moonlight, I caught a glimpse of its face, or what should have been a face. The features were wrong, stretched and distorted, with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. Then it turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving Connor and me shaking with terror. We didn't sleep that night. We took turns watching the window, but the figure didn't return. In the morning, we tried to convince ourselves it had been a dream, a shared hallucination brought on by too much junk food and late-night video games. But when we finally worked up the courage to check the treehouse later that day, we found evidence that our visitor had been real. The treehouse had been altered. Our belongings, which we'd left scattered around the small space, had been arranged in precise patterns. Comic books were stacked in a perfect pyramid in the center of the floor. Action figures were lined up in military formation along one wall. Most unsettling, the battery-powered lantern we'd left hanging from a hook was now sitting outside the treehouse, placed carefully at the base of the tree. Connor and I climbed up to investigate, but the wrongness of the scene was overwhelming. Everything had been touched, moved, arranged by hands that weren't ours. The space felt violated, contaminated by an alien presence. We grabbed our most valuable possessions and fled, never to return to our former sanctuary. That was the last time Connor and I spent time together in the treehouse. His parents' divorce was finalized that August, and he moved away with his mother to live with relatives in another state. Before he left, we made a pact never to tell anyone about what we'd seen, but we also never talked about it between ourselves. Some experiences are too frightening to put into words, even with your closest friend. The strange incidents continued throughout the fall, even after Connor was gone. Our outdoor furniture would be rearranged overnight. Lawn chairs moved into perfect circles, the picnic table relocated to different spots around the yard. My mother began keeping a log of the incidents, convinced that someone was playing elaborate pranks on our family. The clicking sounds became a regular part of evening background noise, though I seemed to be the only family member who noticed them. They would start around sunset and continue intermittently until well after midnight. Sometimes they came from the forest, sometimes from our own yard, and occasionally from disturbingly close to the house. I began sleeping with my bedroom curtains drawn tight, afraid to look out at night. But even with the windows covered, I could sense when the figure was in our yard. The air would feel different, thicker, more oppressive. The normal sounds of night would fade, replaced by an unnatural silence that made my skin crawl. My academic performance suffered that fall. I had trouble concentrating in school, and my teachers noticed that I seemed tired and distracted. At home, I jumped at unexpected sounds and refused to go outside after dark. My parents attributed my behavior to Connor's departure and the stress of starting a new school year, but I knew the real cause of my anxiety. The thing in the woods was still watching, still visiting our property, still rearranging our belongings according to some incomprehensible logic. And with each passing week, its presence felt more intrusive, more threatening. In December, a severe ice storm struck our area, coating everything in a thick layer of frozen precipitation. The weight of the ice brought down power lines and tree branches throughout the region. In our backyard, one of the massive maples that supported the treehouse split down the middle, taking half the structure with it when it fell. My father hired a crew to remove the fallen tree and the damaged treehouse remains. I was secretly relieved. With the structure gone, perhaps the nightly visitor would lose interest in our property. For several weeks, this seemed to be the case. The clicking sounds stopped, the furniture rearranging ceased, and the oppressive feeling that had haunted our evenings began to fade. But in February, something happened that changed my understanding of what we'd been dealing with. I was walking home from school when I noticed police cars parked at the entrance to the forest preserve behind our house. Curious, I approached one of the officers and asked what was happening. He explained that they'd found evidence of someone living illegally in the woods, makeshift shelters, stolen property, and signs of long-term habitation. What made the discovery particularly disturbing was the nature of the camp. The person had been collecting items from surrounding neighborhoods and arranging them in bizarre patterns and structures. The officer described finding carefully constructed arrangements of lawn furniture, garden decorations, and children's toys, all laid out in complex geometric patterns among the trees. Photographs and personal items taken from houses had been organized into elaborate displays. Most unsettling were the detailed notes and sketches documenting the daily routines of local families. When they left for work, when children played outside, which houses had dogs. As the officer spoke, I realized with growing horror that our family had been among those being watched and documented. The person living in the woods had been studying us, learning our habits, and gradually working up the courage for more direct contact. The treehouse had been visible from deep in the forest, and my daily presence there had made me a primary target for observation. The authorities never found the person responsible for the camp. They suspected he'd fled the area when the treehouse came down, possibly interpreting its destruction as a sign that his presence had been discovered. But they did find evidence suggesting he'd been living in the woods for years, surviving by scavenging and stealing, and becoming increasingly obsessed with the families whose properties bordered the forest. Years later, when I was in high school, I researched the history of our area and discovered that the forest preserve had long been associated with stories of hermits and recluses who chose to live off the grid. Local newspapers from the 1980s contained several reports of wild men spotted in the woods, people who'd rejected society and survived by their wits in the wilderness. Some of these individuals had been harmless eccentrics, but others had become dangerous as their isolation and mental illness progressed. The clicking sounds Connor and I had heard were likely some form of self-soothing behavior or communication attempt by someone whose grip on reality had been severely compromised by years of solitude. Understanding the rational explanation for our experiences didn't diminish their impact on my life. I've never been comfortable in wooded areas since that summer, and I still sleep with curtains drawn tight. The knowledge that someone had been watching me, studying my routines, and gradually working up the courage to make contact remains one of the most violating experiences of my life. Connor and I reconnected briefly through social media in college, but we never discussed what happened during that summer in 1999. Some experiences are too personal, too frightening to revisit, even with the person who shared them. The fear we felt was real, even if we didn't understand its source at the time. My parents still live in the same house, though they've installed security lighting and cameras around the property. The forest preserve has been more heavily patrolled since the discovery of the illegal camp, but I still feel uneasy when I visit. Sometimes, walking across the backyard where the treehouse once stood, I catch myself listening for clicking sounds in the woods. The thing that disturbs me most is not knowing what might have happened if the treehouse hadn't come down that winter. The person in the woods had been growing bolder, more willing to approach the house, more comfortable with making his presence known. Where would that escalation have led? What did he want from us? I've learned to live with these questions, but I've never forgotten the lesson they taught me. The world contains people who exist outside the boundaries of normal society, individuals whose isolation and mental illness can make them unpredictable and dangerous. Sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones that are entirely human, driven by loneliness and madness to behaviors that defy understanding. God only knows what his ultimate intentions were, but I'm grateful I never had to find out. I remember settling into our little two-man tent that evening with a sense of calm expectation. Just me and my husband, Joseph, tucked away in a remote corner of the Galloway forest. We'd been planning this trip for months, seeking escape from deadlines and the constant drone of city life. The forest welcomed us with its ancient embrace, tall pines swaying gently overhead as we followed winding trails through the afternoon. This spot is perfect. Joseph had declared, setting down his backpack in a small clearing surrounded by dense trees. I agreed, breathing in air that tasted clean and verdant, untouched by exhaust fumes and concrete dust. We'd hiked for nearly 6 hours, following a route that took us deeper into the wilderness than we'd ever ventured before. The isolation was deliberate. We wanted stars without light pollution, silence without distant traffic, and the raw experience of being truly alone with nature. By the time we set up camp, my muscles ached pleasantly, my face flushed from exertion and mountain air. Joseph worked methodically, hammering stakes and stretching canvas while I arranged our sleeping bags and gathered kindling for a small fire. The routine felt comfortable, something we'd perfected over years of weekend excursions, though never quite this remote. "No cell service," Joseph noted, checking his phone before tucking it away. "Just us and the trees." The words should have been comforting. Instead, they lodged in my mind, a quiet warning I dismissed as paranoia. Later, I would curse myself for not heeding that first flicker of unease. We cooked a simple meal over the campfire, canned stew heated in a small pot, crusty bread we'd carried wrapped in foil. The forest grew darker around us, shadows deepening between trees, sounds shifting from birdsong to the occasional rustle of nocturnal creatures stirring awake. "Listen," Joseph whispered as we finished eating. Complete silence. But it wasn't silent. Not really. The forest breathed around us, wind through branches, distant water trickling over stones, the subtle symphony of insects and creatures too small to see. I strained my ears, trying to catalog each sound, to establish a baseline of normal. Why this seemed important, I couldn't articulate. We retired early, exhausted from the hike. The tent felt secure, a fragile haven of civilization in the wilderness. Joseph fell asleep almost immediately, his breathing deep and rhythmic beside me. I lay awake longer, watching patterns of moonlight dapple the tent fabric, listening to the forest settle into its nighttime melody. Eventually, I drifted off, lulled by Joseph's steady breathing and the gentle whisper of wind through pine needles. I was exhausted in that good, contented way that usually promises solid, dreamless sleep. I had no idea what waited in the darkness. Sometime after midnight, I stirred awake. At first, all I noticed was the thick darkness, broken only by the faint glow of moonlight edging through the fabric of our tent. My eyes darted around, trying to reorient. The familiar weight of our sleeping bag felt suddenly confining, and my bladder signaled urgent discomfort. I realized I needed to step outside for a bathroom break. Nothing unusual there. Just one of those moments when nature calls inconveniently during the night. I was tempted to ignore it, to force myself back to sleep, but the pressure was insistent. I knew I wouldn't be able to drift off again without taking care of business. I turned to check on Joseph, quietly making sure I wouldn't disturb him. He was still asleep, breathing in that slow, calm rhythm I knew so well. His face looked peaceful in the faint moonlight, untroubled by whatever had pulled me from slumber. I'd almost made up my mind to slip out silently when a strange noise cut through the stillness. A slow, methodical scratching, like fingers dragging against the ground. The sound came from just outside our tent, too deliberate to be a forest creature scurrying past. My thoughts raced in seconds. Perhaps it was just some curious animal sniffing around our campsite, drawn by lingering food scents. But this sound was too measured, almost deliberate, a conscious rhythm of scrape, pause, scrape that raised the fine hairs on my arms. I froze, ears straining to interpret the sound. The scratching continued, unhurried and persistent. It wasn't the random rustling of leaves or the skittering of small paws. This was steady, intentional, human. My bladder's urgency suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the growing dread that pooled in my stomach. Someone was outside our tent, inches away from where we slept, digging into the earth with what sounded like bare hands. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Another camper looking for something they'd dropped, a forest ranger checking the soil, even a researcher collecting samples. But at this hour, in this isolated spot, the excuses withered as the scratching continued, metronomic and disturbing. I glanced at Joseph again, debating whether to wake him. Would he think I was overreacting? The scratching grew slightly louder, more vigorous, as if whoever, or whatever, was outside had found renewed purpose in their task. With my breath caught in my throat, I paused, listening for any sign it had moved away. When the sound didn't fade, I gathered what little courage remained and inched toward the tent flap. My fingers trembled as they found the cold metal of the zipper. I eased the tent zipper open just a bit, wincing at each small click of metal teeth separating. A slice of moonlight spilled in, illuminating the forest floor. At first, all I could see were shadows of shrubs and the outline of tall trunks, their bark silvered by moonlight. Then I spotted movement a few feet to my left, a shape crouched low against the ground. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I realized it was a woman. She looked surprisingly young, perhaps in her 20s, with hair tangled and hanging around her face in clumps. She was so close to our tent that I wondered how I hadn't heard her approach. She was digging into the soil with her bare hands, scooping out little clumps of dirt as if unearthing some hidden treasure. There was something profoundly disturbing about her posture. She moved in slow, careful motions, almost like she was in a trance. Her fingers curved like claws, nails caked with earth, scraping deeper into the growing hole beside our tent. I tried to steady myself, but my pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out every other sound. I kept glancing back to Joseph, who was still cluelessly asleep. The moonlight cast bizarre shadows across the woman's face, hollowing her cheeks and darkening her eye sockets until she looked almost skeletal. The idea of confronting a stranger in the middle of nowhere left me frozen with indecision. For a second, I considered zipping the tent closed and pretending I hadn't seen her. But what if she needed help? What if she was injured or lost? Or worse, what if she meant us harm? The question alone made my skin prickle with goose flesh. So I shuffled backward and nudged Joseph awake. In a hushed whisper, I told him there was someone right outside. His eyes snapped open, instantly alert in a way that told me he recognized the tension in my voice. He followed my gaze to the half-open zipper. Without hesitating, he reached for our flashlight. I stayed low, peeking over his shoulder as he directed a small beam of light toward the figure. She barely reacted, just paused her digging for a moment, as if considering whether the interruption was worth acknowledging. The beam lit up her face. A mixture of dirt and sweat clung to her skin, and her eyes had a distant look, unfocused and glassy, as if she wasn't fully present in that moment. "Hey, are you okay?" Joseph called out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness of the forest. But she didn't respond. She just slowly stood, letting the loose earth drop from her fingertips. For a heartbeat, I thought she might lash out or speak, but she remained silent, her expression blank, yet somehow intense. Then, in one fluid motion, she turned and walked deeper into the darkness, leaving that shallow hole right next to our tent. Joseph and I exchanged a look of disbelief. Part of me wanted to chase her down, find out who she was and what she was doing, but common sense said otherwise. The isolation of the place was suddenly overwhelming. We were miles from the nearest road, farther still from other people who might help if things went wrong. After a few tense minutes of debate, I decided I still needed to step outside. I couldn't exactly hold it till dawn, so I unzipped the tent the rest of the way, scanning the shadows for any trace of the woman. The night air felt colder than it had an hour before, seeping through my jacket and raising goosebumps along my arms. Every tree took on a menacing outline, branches reaching like gnarled fingers. Shadows pooled in unexpected places, creating pockets of absolute darkness where anything might hide. My husband stood guard, flashlight sweeping left and right while I tended to my business just a few feet from our tent. No sign of the strange woman anywhere, but the unease lingered, a weight pressing against my chest. Once I returned to the tent, we tried to settle down again. We talked in hushed tones, speculating on what we had just witnessed. Was she a lost hiker? A local who wandered away from another campsite? Someone with mental health issues who'd found her way deep into the forest? Neither explanation felt quite right. "I don't like this," Joseph whispered, still clutching the flashlight. "She was digging right next to where we're sleeping." What could she possibly be looking for? I wondered aloud, my imagination conjuring images of buried items, weapons, evidence, human remains. Each possibility seemed more disturbing than the last. The hole itself troubled me. Not quite a foot deep, roughly circular, dug with obvious purpose. Not random scratching or animal foraging. She had been looking for something specific, or perhaps preparing to place something there. Exhaustion eventually won out over adrenaline, and we lay back down, the zipper firmly closed. I closed my eyes, trying to slow my racing thoughts, hoping the rest of the night would pass quietly. But every time the wind rustled the leaves, I braced for the possibility of seeing her again, crouched just inches away from where we lay. The tent suddenly felt too thin, almost transparent, like no barrier at all between us and whatever lurked in the forest. The nylon walls that had seemed sturdy enough hours ago now felt like tissue paper, offering no real protection. I think I drifted off for a bit, though my dreams were uneasy fragments of pursuit and discovery. My mind kept returning to the sight of her, kneeling in the moonlight, nails scratching into the dirt, and that hollow expression on her face, the kind that hinted at some buried distress, or a reality far different from ours. Joseph stayed awake longer, I could tell. He shifted around, hands gripping the flashlight, as if waiting for her to come back. That was how the first part of the night played out. Two people in a campsite that had seemed so comforting just hours before, now wrestling with the notion that safety can vanish with one bizarre encounter. We had no clue what would happen next, or if this stranger would return. All we could do was lie there, ears straining for another hint of movement, waiting for dawn and hoping she wouldn't appear again. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I recall is being startled awake by a metallic rattle just outside the tent. It took me a second to realize it wasn't part of a dream. No, this was real. A sound of something or someone picking through our gear. My insides twisted at the thought that the stranger from before was back. I turned my head and saw Joseph's eyes snap open too. Neither of us spoke. We just locked gazes, letting the clattering go on for a tense moment before deciding to act. He unzipped the door as quietly as he could, stepping out with the flashlight in hand. I poked my head out right behind him, my pulse pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Sure enough, she was there. The same person, the same filthy clothes and unkempt hair. Only now she seemed deeply absorbed in our supplies. Pots and utensils were scattered around her feet. She crouched low, head tilted, as if the items themselves were more fascinating than we were. She hadn't tried to take off with anything, but the way she examined our belongings left me unnerved. There was an eerie curiosity in her expression, almost childlike, but it clashed with the rest of her disheveled appearance. She turned a metal spork over in her hands, studying it with an intensity that seemed wildly disproportionate. Joseph called out to her, not exactly shouting, but loud enough to cut through the hush of the forest. "Hey, that's ours. Do you need help or something?" His voice betrayed the tension he was feeling, a slight tremor undermining his attempt at authority. The flashlight beam fell across her face, revealing eyes that glinted in the harsh light. She lifted her head, letting a small metal cup clatter from her grip. She didn't move or speak, just stared. I tried to read something, anything in her eyes, but came up blank. Was she hostile? Confused? Lost? My thoughts were all over the place. A heavy knot tightened in my gut as I realized how vulnerable we were. Joseph was still trying to get through to her, asking if she was okay, if she needed food or water or directions. But she offered no explanation, no hint at what she might want. She just held that unnerving stare. It was as if our words weren't registering. Or maybe she just didn't care. Before I could even decide what to do, Joseph backed away, retreating to the tent flap. He couldn't force her to leave without risking a full confrontation. Neither of us wanted that. We were out here alone, in the middle of nowhere, with no quick way to call for assistance. If she didn't budge, we were at a disadvantage. I stood there in the open air for a moment, wondering if maybe I could reason with her. But I froze, tongue-tied and overwhelmed by her strange presence. She looked at me, and the flashlight beam caught a smudge of dirt across her cheek that gave her a feral quality. Slowly, she lowered herself back into a crouch, rummaging around our stuff with total disregard for the tension in the air. A million scenarios bounced around my head. Should we pack up and leave? Confront her more forcefully? Try to communicate again? My instincts screamed that a person who acted this way wasn't going to respond to normal logic. So I decided to return to the tent, quietly zipping the door shut behind me and Joseph. The two of us sat there for several minutes, listening to every scrape and shuffle outside. It felt like we were stranded in a surreal standoff with no clear path out. "What do we do?" I whispered, clutching Joseph's arm. "She's not stealing anything. She's just examining everything." "I don't know," he admitted, "but I don't like it. There's something wrong with her." Eventually, the rummaging sounds faded. I exhaled, trying to settle the hammering in my chest. Maybe she'd move on. Maybe this would become just another bizarre campfire story. But then the digging returned. The same slow, deliberate scraping near the side of the tent. I realized she was back at that little hole she'd started. The sound felt closer than ever, like she was practically inches from my head. We both jumped when I finally shouted through the tent walls, telling her to stop. The instant the words left my mouth, there was a frantic shuffle. It reminded me of the way a startled animal might tear through the brush. I scrambled to peer outside, but by the time I got the zipper partway open, she was gone. Just darkness, shifting shadows, and the faint rustling of leaves. The hole beside our tent was now nearly a foot deep. Joseph grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, sweeping the beam across the clearing. No sign of her. But something caught his attention in the freshly dug hole. "There's something here," he said, voice tight with tension. I moved beside him, peering down into the dark pit. At first, I saw nothing but dirt and small stones. Then the flashlight beam caught something pale, a flash of white against the dark soil. Joseph knelt, hesitated, then reached into the hole. I wanted to stop him, to tell him not to touch whatever was buried there, but curiosity overrode my caution. He pulled out a small object and held it up to the light. It was a tooth, a human molar, roots intact, with dirt still clinging to it. "Oh God," I whispered, recoiling. "Is that real?" Joseph turned it over in his palm, his face draining of color. "It looks real. And fresh." The implication hung in the air between us. Where had it come from? Who did it belong to? And why was this strange woman digging it up in the middle of the night? We didn't sleep well after that. Every passing minute dragged on while we waited for her to return. Joseph gripped the flashlight, occasionally shining it through the thin fabric of the tent to see if anyone was out there. The forest seemed to close in, thick with tension. I couldn't manage to keep my eyes shut for more than a minute or two before some small rustle made me start all over again. Dawn came at last, bringing a weak sliver of gray light through the canopy. We cautiously unzipped the tent, feeling like intruders on our own campsite. Our gear was scattered over the area: cookware, water bottles, clothing items. She had touched everything, inspected it, then tossed it aside. The only thing more unsettling than that chaos was the hole now dug nearly a foot deep beside our tent. No obvious reason, just a hole, as if that had been her main objective all along. The tooth lay where Joseph had placed it on a flat rock, a mute testimony to something we couldn't comprehend. My husband and I scanned the area, but she was nowhere to be found. No footprints beyond some smudges of dirt, no sign of another tent or bag of her own, just our stuff left in disarray. We collected what we could, still half expecting her to materialize from behind a tree. "We need to report this," Joseph said, stuffing his sleeping bag into its compression sack with jerky movements. "To the rangers or police or someone." I nodded, though the prospect of explaining what happened made me doubt we'd be taken seriously. A strange woman digging holes and examining camping gear? It sounded absurd in the morning light, despite the evidence scattered around us. "What about the tooth?" I asked, not wanting to touch it, but equally reluctant to leave it behind. Joseph considered for a moment, then pulled out a small Ziploc bag we used for food storage. He carefully placed the tooth inside, sealing it shut. "Evidence," he said grimly. As we packed, I noticed something we'd missed in the night: a series of small holes similar to the one by our tent, forming a rough line leading into the trees. Each about the same size, each seemingly dug by hand, spaced about 10 feet apart. "Joseph," I called, pointing. "Look at this." He joined me, following my gaze to the line of excavations. "How many are there?" We followed the trail of holes into the woods, counting as we went. 6, 7, 8. They continued in a straight line, each one freshly dug. At the 9th hole, we found another tooth, and a fingernail in the 10th. Part of me was still braced for her to appear again, maybe running at us or circling the site in that awkward crouch. But the forest remained still, watching us with green indifference as we hurried back to break down our tent. We left that clearing with an odd mixture of guilt and relief. Guilt for not being able to help someone who, for all we knew, needed it desperately. Relief for escaping an encounter that felt steeped in danger, even if it never escalated into outright violence. During the entire hike back, I kept twisting around to see if she was following us. The shadows seemed to move at the corner of my vision, but I never saw her again. By the time we reached the safer, more populated trails, I realized I had been holding my breath in tense bursts. We reported the incident at the ranger station, showing them the tooth and describing the woman and the line of holes. They took our statement with professional concern, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They promised to investigate, to send someone to check the area. I wonder if they ever did. The tooth, they told us, would be turned over to the proper authorities. We never heard what became of it, whether it was human or animal, recent or ancient, significant or meaningless. Some questions remain unanswered no matter how desperately you want closure. That night, safe in our own bedroom, miles from the forest, I still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the house settling made me tense. I kept seeing her face in my mind. That vacant stare, the dirt-streaked skin, the methodical way she dug into the earth as if compelled by some force beyond reasoning. Joseph suggested we stop camping for a while. I agreed, though something in me resisted the idea of letting one disturbing encounter rob us of something we loved. Still, whenever I close my eyes and imagine a tent around me, I hear the scratching again. Nails against soil, searching, always searching. Looking back, it's the most unnerving experience I've had, worse than storms or wildlife or anything else you typically worry about in the wilderness. Because when it's a person acting that way, you can't predict what's going to happen. You can't understand their motivations or anticipate their next move. The unknown lingers, creeping under your skin, reminding you that, out in the wild, your sense of safety can shatter without warning. And all it takes is one stranger with a strange agenda. Sometimes I wonder who she was. What drove her to dig those holes in the dark? What significance did those buried items hold? Was she placing them or retrieving them? Was she dangerous or damaged or both? I'll never know. But sometimes, when I'm drifting off to sleep, I imagine her still out there in those woods, crouched low to the ground, fingers working methodically into the soil, still digging, still searching, and finding things that should perhaps remain buried. And I wonder, with a shudder that refuses to fade even years later, if someday she'll dig up something far worse than a tooth. Or if someday someone will find her, a mystery buried in the forest soil with no explanation for the line of holes she left behind. My name is Dale Ashworth. Back in '98, I was working a dead-end job, selling insurance to farmers outside of Ely, Nevada. Life in Ely was quiet, too quiet. Not much ever happened, except for that one time. It started with Old Man Jensen. He came into town one afternoon, eyes wide and wild, babbling about something tearing through his chicken coop, taking his livestock. Said it was like nothing he'd ever seen before. Now, Old Man Jensen was known to chase a shot of whiskey with a tall tale, so most folks just nodded along. But I'd seen a look in his eyes, a raw terror I hadn't seen since my time in the service. It stuck with me. A few days later, I was driving back from a sales call out near Steptoe Creek. It was getting late, the sun already dipping below the Shoshone Mountains. Shadows stretched long and deep, turning the sagebrush into lurking shapes. I stopped at a roadside diner for a cup of coffee and a slice of pie. The place was empty except for a trucker hunched over a plate of fries and the waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Doris. "Quiet night," I said, settling onto the red vinyl stool. Doris just shrugged. "Everyone's on edge. Sheriff's been warning folks about some missing cattle out by the old copper mine." I took a sip of the bitter coffee. "Old Man Jensen's story?" Doris looked at me, surprised. "You heard about that? Sheriff thinks it's coyotes, but..." She trailed off, shaking her head. I finished my pie and paid up. The night air was cold, sharp against my skin. I started the drive back to Ely, the headlights cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw it. A flash of movement in the headlights, too big for a coyote, too fast for a dog. It darted across the road, disappearing into the sagebrush. I pulled over, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what I expected to find. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. Or maybe Old Man Jensen wasn't so crazy after all. I got out of the car, the silence heavy around me. The only sound was the wind whistling through the sagebrush. I took a few steps toward where I'd seen the movement, my hand hovering near the tire iron I kept under the driver's seat. "Hello?" My voice sounded small and lost in the vastness of the night. There was no answer, just the wind and the silence. I waited, listening, but there was nothing. I told myself it was nothing. Just a coyote, or maybe even a stray dog. But deep down I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold desert air. The next morning, I called the sheriff's office. They weren't much help. Said they'd had a few calls, but nothing concrete. Just shadows and rumors. But the rumors grew. A camper found his supplies torn apart, his food gone. A rancher reported strange tracks near his water trough, tracks unlike anything he'd seen before. The townsfolk of Ely, once dismissive, started locking their doors at night. The whispers started spreading like wildfire through the dry brush. Something was out there. Something hungry. One night I was having a beer at the only bar in town, the Miner's Rest. The place was mostly empty, just a few regulars huddled at the bar, speaking in hushed tones. "Heard they found Jimmy's truck out by the old mine," said a man in a dusty cowboy hat. Truck was empty, door wide open. Another man chimed in, shaking his head. Jimmy was a young guy, just moved to town a few months back. He was trying to make a go of it, working on the ranch outside of town. I'd sold him a life insurance policy, just in case. Now I wished I hadn't. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the flash of movement in my headlights, hearing the whispers in the bar. I knew I had to do something. I drove out to the old copper mine the next day. The road was little more than a dirt track, barely wide enough for my car. The mine itself was a scar on the landscape, a gaping maw of darkness leading into the heart of the mountain. The air was heavy with a silence that felt almost oppressive. I got out of the car, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. And then I saw them. The tracks. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Large, three-toed prints sunk deep into the dry earth. They led towards the mine entrance, disappearing into the darkness. I knew then that whatever had taken Jimmy, whatever was stalking the outskirts of Ely, was real. And it was waiting for me inside that mine. I stood there, staring at those tracks for what felt like hours, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Three-toed prints, each one nearly the size of a dinner plate, with strange claw marks extending forward. Not a bear, not a mountain lion. Nothing native to these parts could leave marks like these. I snapped a few photos with the disposable camera I kept in my glove box for insurance claims. Evidence, I thought. Something to show Sheriff Daniels that this wasn't just another tall tale. Back in town, I went straight to the sheriff's office. Marge, the dispatcher, gave me a tired smile as I walked in. "Dale Ashworth," she said. "What brings you by today? Not another speeding ticket, I hope." "I need to see Sheriff Daniels," I replied, clutching the camera in my sweaty palm. "It's important." Sheriff Daniels was a stocky woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. She'd moved to Ely after 20 years with the Las Vegas PD, looking for a quieter life. I doubted this was what she had in mind. "Ashworth," she nodded, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "What can I do for you?" I told her everything. Jensen's chickens, the thing I'd seen on the road, Jimmy's empty truck, and the tracks leading into the mine. She listened without interrupting, her expression giving nothing away. "And you've got pictures of these tracks?" she asked when I finished. I handed over the camera. "They need to be developed, but they're there. Sheriff, something's out there. Something dangerous." She sighed, pocketing the camera. "I'll get these developed and check out the mine myself. In the meantime, try not to spread panic. This town runs on tourism and ranching. Last thing we need is rumors about some monster in the hills." I left feeling dismissed. A familiar feeling in Ely. I'd only lived there for 3 years, still an outsider by local standards. But I knew what I'd seen. That night, I dreamed of the mine. In my dream, I was walking deeper and deeper into its dark tunnels, the walls pressing in around me, the air thick with the smell of copper and something else, something rotten and ancient. I could hear scratching, scuttling sounds ahead of me, getting closer. I woke up gasping for air, sheets soaked with sweat. The next day brought news that chilled the town to its core. 2 teenagers, out for a joyride, had gone missing. Their car was found abandoned at the Steptoe Valley overlook, keys still in the ignition, radio still playing. No signs of struggle, no blood, just empty space where 2 young lives should have been. The town called an emergency meeting at the high school gymnasium. Nearly everyone showed up. The air was thick with fear and cigarette smoke as Sheriff Daniels tried to maintain calm. "At this time, we have no evidence of foul play," she announced, her voice steady. "Search and rescue teams are combing the area. We'll find those kids." An angry voice called out from the back of the room. "What about the tracks, Sheriff? The ones Dale found?" All eyes turned to me. I felt the weight of their stares, some curious, others accusatory. Sheriff Daniels cleared her throat. "We're investigating every lead. But right now, I need everyone to stay calm and stay out of the back country until we know more." After the meeting, Jensen approached me, his weathered face tight with worry. "You believe me now, don't you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "About what I saw?" I nodded. "What exactly did you see, Jensen? You never really said." He glanced around nervously as if afraid of being overheard. "It was big. Moved on 2 legs but not like a man. Too fast. Too jerky. Like watching one of them stop-motion monsters in the movies. And its eyes..." He shuddered. "They caught the light from my porch. Glowed like hot coals." A chill ran down my spine. "Why didn't you tell the sheriff all this?" Jensen gave a bitter laugh. "You think she'd believe an old drunk like me? Hell, half the time I don't believe myself." That night, Ely changed. Doors were double locked, shotguns loaded, children kept indoors. The easy peace of our quiet town had been shattered. Something was hunting in the shadows of the Nevada desert, and we were all potential prey. The next morning, I was awakened by insistent knocking at my door. It was Tom Grady, who ran the local garage. "Dale?" he said, his face pale beneath his perpetual tan. "Sheriff wants to see you. They found something at the mine." The drive to Steptoe Mine was tense, the road now lined with police cruisers and a county coroner's van. My stomach dropped at the sight. Whatever they'd found, it wasn't good. Sheriff Daniels was standing near the mine entrance, conferring with a man in a state police uniform. When she saw me, she broke away and walked over. "You were right about the tracks," she said without preamble. "State's sending in a wildlife expert. But that's not why I called you here." She led me to a clearing near the mine entrance. The ground had been recently disturbed, the dirt freshly turned. And there, half uncovered, was a human arm, the flesh partially torn away, the bone gleaming white in the morning sun. "We think it's Jimmy," she said, her voice professionally detached. "Can't be sure until the coroner does his job, but the watch matches the description his mother gave us." I felt sick. What did this to him?" Sheriff Daniels shook her head. "That's what I'm hoping you can help us figure out. You're the one who's been connecting the dots. And there's something else." She handed me a plastic evidence bag. Inside was a large curved claw, nearly 6 inches long. It was a sickly yellowish color, tapering to a wicked point. "Found it stuck in what's left of his rib cage," she said quietly. "Never seen anything like it. You?" I shook my head, unable to take my eyes off the claw. It looked prehistoric, like something that belonged to a creature that should have died out millions of years ago. "Whatever left those tracks," I said. "Whatever killed Jimmy. I think it's still in that mine." Sheriff Daniels nodded grimly. "That's what I'm afraid of. And I think it's time we went in after it." The next 24 hours were a blur of preparation. Sheriff Daniels assembled a small team. Herself, me, Deputy Carson, a former Army Ranger, Dr. Eliza Webb, the county coroner, and surprisingly, Old Man Jensen, who knew the layout of the mine better than anyone. Used to work those tunnels back in the 70s, he explained, his hands shaking slightly as he traced routes on an old mining map. Place goes deeper than most folks realize. Company records say they abandoned it because the copper ran out. But that ain't the whole truth. What is the truth? I asked, sensing there was more to his story. Jensen's watery blue eyes met mine. Men went missing. Equipment got destroyed. Strange noises from the deep shafts. Company called it cave-ins and equipment malfunctions. But us miners, we knew better. Something was down there with us. Sheriff Daniels looked skeptical, but didn't dismiss him outright. Whatever's in there has killed at least one person that we know of. Maybe 3, if it's got those teenagers. We go in armed, we stay together, and at the first sign of serious trouble, we retreat. This isn't about being heroes. We gathered at the mine entrance at dawn. The early morning light cast long shadows across the rocky terrain, making every juniper bush and scrub oak look like a crouching figure. We were armed with shotguns, pistols, high-powered flashlights, and radios. Dr. Webb carried a tranquilizer gun loaded with enough ketamine to drop a grizzly. Just in case it's something we can capture, she explained, though her tone suggested she didn't believe that would be possible. The entrance to Steptoe Mine was a dark rectangle cut into the mountainside, supported by weathered timber beams. A set of rusted rails extended from the opening, remnants of the carts that once carried copper ore from the depths. The tracks I'd seen earlier led straight inside, distinct even in the hard-packed dirt of the mine floor. Everybody stay close, Sheriff Daniels instructed. Carson takes point. I'll bring up the rear. Dale, you and Dr. Webb stay in the middle with Jensen. The mine swallowed us like a living thing. 20 feet in, the daylight faded to a distant rectangle, and the temperature dropped noticeably. Our flashlight beams cut through the darkness, illuminating rough-hewn walls streaked with copper oxide and ancient soot from mining lamps. The air was stale, heavy with dust and the metallic tang of minerals. Jensen guided us deeper, pointing out side tunnels and ventilation shafts. Main shaft goes down almost 800 feet, he explained. But there's natural caverns too, places the mining company never fully mapped. We followed the tracks, which remained clear in the dust on the tunnel floor. They led us deeper into the mine, past abandoned equipment and the occasional rat skeleton. The silence was oppressive, broken only by our footsteps and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. After about half an hour, we reached a junction where the mine split into 3 separate tunnels. The tracks led down the middle passage, which sloped steeply downward. This one goes to the deepest part, Jensen said, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. Where they hit the water table. Had to stop drilling there. Deputy Carson knelt by the tracks, examining them closely with his flashlight. These look fresher here. Whatever made them, it's been using this path regularly. A sudden noise from deep in the tunnel made us all freeze, a scraping sound like claws on stone followed by a splash. Then silence. It's down there, Jensen whispered, his face pale in the flashlight beam. In the flooded section. Sheriff Daniels chambered around in her shotgun. Let's move. Carefully. The tunnel grew narrower as we descended, the ceiling lower, forcing us to crouch slightly. The air grew damper, and the walls glistened with moisture. The tracks became less distinct in the increasingly muddy floor, but were still visible. Then we found the first body. It was one of the missing teenagers, or what was left of him. The remains had been partially consumed, the flesh torn from the bones in large chunks. His face was mercifully intact, frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Dr. Webb knelt beside the body, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. This didn't happen here, she said quietly. The body was brought here after death. There's not enough blood. It's storing food, Jensen said, his voice hollow. Like a goddamn pantry. A shiver ran down my spine at the thought. Not just a predator, but something intelligent enough to save its kills for later. Further down the tunnel, the ground became increasingly wet, until we were splashing through shallow puddles. The tunnel eventually opened into a larger chamber, where the mining operation had broken through into a natural cavern. The floor was covered in about 2 feet of dark water, reflecting our flashlight beams in distorted patterns against the ceiling. And there, half submerged in the murky water, was the second teenager. Unlike the first, this body showed signs of being recently killed. Blood still clouded the water around it. "It's close," Deputy Carson whispered, scanning the darkness with his light. "Very close." That's when we heard it. A sound like wet leather stretching, followed by a splash from the far side of the cavern. All our lights swung in that direction, illuminating a sight that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It rose from the water like something from a primeval nightmare. Tall, at least 7 feet, with a body that seemed wrong in ways I couldn't immediately process. Its skin was a sickly grayish green, slick with moisture, stretched tight over a frame that was both skeletal and muscular. The head was elongated, lizard-like, with a mouth full of needle-sharp teeth that gleamed in our flashlight beams. Its eyes reflected the light like a cat's, glowing an unnatural yellow-orange. But it was the limbs that disturbed me most. Too long, too jointed, ending in 3-fingered hands and feet tipped with the same curved claws we'd found in Jimmy's body. It moved with a jerky, unsettling grace like something trying to remember how muscles should work. For a moment, we all stood frozen in horror, our lights fixed on the creature. It tilted its head, studying us with an intelligence that was somehow more terrifying than mindless aggression. Then Sheriff Daniels broke the spell, raising her shotgun. "Everyone back!" The creature moved with impossible speed, leaping from the water and scuttling across the ceiling like a monstrous insect. Dr. Webb fired the tranquilizer gun, but the dart glanced off the creature's hide. Deputy Carson got off 2 shots from his pistol before the thing dropped behind a pile of rocks. "Move!" Sheriff Daniels shouted, firing her shotgun into the darkness where the creature had disappeared. "Back to the junction." We retreated in panicked disorder, splashing through the water, slipping in the mud. I could hear it moving around us, circling, using the darkness and its knowledge of the tunnels to flank us. Jensen was ahead of me when I heard him scream. I swung my light toward the sound just in time to see the creature drag him into a side tunnel, its clawed hand clamped over his mouth. I fired my pistol, the shots deafening in the confined space, but I couldn't tell if I hit anything. We reached the junction, gasping for breath, down 1 man. Sheriff Daniels did a quick head count. "Where's Jensen?" "It got him," I said, still trying to process what I'd seen. "Pulled him into a side tunnel. I shot at it, but..." Dr. Webb was pale, her hands shaking as she tried to reload the tranquilizer gun. "That thing, it's not natural, not any known species." "We need to get out," Deputy Carson said, his professional calm finally cracking. "Call in the National Guard or something, that thing is..." He never finished his sentence. With a sound like tearing canvas, the ceiling above us collapsed, and the creature dropped into our midst. It landed on Carson, claws sinking deep into his shoulders. His scream was cut short as those terrible jaws closed on his throat. Sheriff Daniels fired, the shotgun blast catching the creature in its side. It screeched, a high, piercing sound that made my teeth ache, and released Carson, who collapsed in a bloody heap. Dr. Webb grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the exit tunnel. "Run!" We ran, the creature's shrieks echoing behind us. Sheriff Daniels brought up the rear, firing backward as she ran. I could hear the thing pursuing us, its strange, multi-jointed gait causing an uneven rhythm of splashes and scrapes. Daylight appeared ahead, the exit still so far away. My lungs burned, my legs numb from exertion and fear. Behind us, the creature's shrieks grew closer. Then Sheriff Daniels cried out. I turned to see her on the ground, the creature on top of her, its claws tearing at her tactical vest. Dr. Webb and I both fired, our shots echoing deafeningly in the tunnel. The creature jerked with the impacts but didn't fall. Instead, it looked up at us, those terrible orange eyes reflecting our flashlight beams. And it made a sound. Not a shriek this time, but something worse. Something like laughter. Then it grabbed Sheriff Daniels and dragged her into the darkness. Dr. Webb and I staggered out of the mine into the harsh daylight, blood-spattered and wild-eyed. We were the only survivors of the expedition into Steptoe Mine. Whatever dwelled in those dark tunnels had claimed 3 more victims in a matter of minutes. And I knew, with cold certainty, that it wouldn't stay in the mine forever. News of the disaster spread through Ely like a wildfire. Sheriff Daniels, Deputy Carson, and Old Man Jensen, all dead, taken by some kind of creature living in the abandoned mine. The rational world we thought we knew had been torn apart in the space of a few hours. County officials took over, setting up a command post at the high school. State police arrived along with wildlife experts and eventually a team from the Bureau of Land Management. Dr. Webb and I told our story again and again, describing the creature, the way it moved, the intelligence in those glowing eyes. Some believed us. Most didn't, or couldn't let themselves believe. They talked about mountain lions, about escaped exotic pets, about methane pockets causing hallucinations. Anything but the truth, that something inhuman was hunting in the desert hills around Ely. 3 days after the mine incident, they sealed the entrance with explosives. Problem contained, the county commissioner announced at a press conference. The unstable mine has been safely closed. Dr. Webb found me at the Miner's Rest that night, nursing my 3rd whiskey. She looked as haunted as I felt, dark circles under her eyes, her hands still trembling slightly when she lifted her glass. They think it's over, she said, her voice bitter. They didn't see what we saw. I nodded, staring into my drink. You know what bothers me most? That sound it made, like it was laughing at us. I've been doing research, she said, lowering her voice. There are legends in this area, Shoshone stories about a creature that lives underground. They called it the hunger that walks, said it would emerge during times of drought to hunt. And we're in year 3 of a drought, I murmured. There's more, she continued. The mine records Jensen mentioned? I found them in the county archives. In 1976, 6 miners disappeared in a single week. The company blamed it on a collapse in the deep shaft, but the bodies were never recovered. They sealed that section and kept mining for another year before shutting down completely. I took another drink, letting the whiskey burn away some of the fear. So it's been down there for decades, maybe longer. And now we've blocked its main exit, she concluded grimly. The realization hit me like a physical blow. You think it'll find another way out. I think it already has. That night, on the southeastern edge of town, a family disappeared from their home. The Connors, husband, wife, 2 children. The front door was found ripped from its hinges, a trail of 3-toed footprints leading away from the house, across the yard, and down into a drainage culvert. The state police organized search parties, combing the desert with dogs and helicopters. They found nothing. The Connors had vanished completely, just like Jimmy and the teenagers. Panic gripped Ely. Those who could leave did, packing up their cars and fleeing to relatives in other towns. Those who stayed armed themselves and boarded up their homes. The motels emptied of tourists, the gas stations ran low on fuel, and the grocery store shelves were stripped bare within days. I stayed, though I'm not sure why. Maybe because I felt responsible somehow. Maybe because I'd looked into those alien eyes and couldn't just walk away. Or maybe because I knew, deep down, that there was nowhere to run. If this thing had been down in that mine for decades, who was to say there weren't others of its kind elsewhere? Dr. Webb stayed too. "I'm a scientist," she said when I asked her why. "I need to understand what this is." We set up a makeshift headquarters in the back room of the Miners' Rest. The owner, a Vietnam vet named Charlie, believed our story completely. "Saw things in the jungle that shouldn't exist," he told us, checking the shells in his shotgun. "Worlds full of nightmares we don't know about." We began mapping the creature's movements, marking each sighting, each missing person, each set of strange tracks found in the soft dirt around town. A pattern emerged. It was using the town's storm drainage system to move undetected, emerging at night to hunt. And it was learning. After the Connors, it became more cautious, taking lone victims who wouldn't be missed immediately. A homeless man who camped by the creek, a long-haul trucker whose rig was found abandoned at a rest stop, a young woman who'd gone for a late-night jog. 1 week after the mine was sealed, we caught a break. A teenage boy, out smoking behind the movie theater, saw something moving in the drainage ditch. Instead of running, he took a video with his phone. Grainy, dark, but clear enough to show a tall, misshapen figure emerging from a large culvert. "It's getting bolder," Dr. Webb said as we reviewed the footage. "Coming out earlier in the evening, less afraid of being seen." "Or hungrier," Charlie added. "Way I see it, this thing's been living off whatever wandered into that mine for years. Now it's got to hunt in the open to feed itself." I studied the map we'd created, the pins marking each incident forming a rough circle around the town center. It's working its way inward, I realized, starting at the edges, moving towards more populated areas. "Testing us," Dr. Webb nodded. "Learning our patterns, our defenses." "So what do we do?" Charlie asked, voicing the question we'd been avoiding. "How do you kill something like this?" The answer came to us unexpectedly, from the most unlikely source. Marge, the sheriff's dispatcher, had been going through Daniels's personal effects. Among them was a voice recorder, her habit from her days on the Vegas force. She'd had it running during the mine expedition. Most of the recording was useless, echoing footsteps, murmured conversations, the same things we remembered. But at the end, after Sheriff Daniels was taken, there was something else. Sounds of struggle, a scream cut short, and then a strange series of clicks and hisses, the creature communicating in its own alien language. Dr. Webb spent hours analyzing the recording, isolating those sounds, playing them at different speeds. "There's a pattern here," she insisted, her scientific mind finding order in what sounded like chaos to me. "And listen to this." She played the recording at half speed. The clicks became deeper, the hisses longer, and beneath them, barely audible, was something like words. "Hungry, long sleep, more come soon." A chill ran down my spine. It's talking. Actually talking. "Or we're hearing what we want to hear," Charlie countered, ever the skeptic despite his willingness to believe in the creature. But Dr. Webb was convinced. "I think it's intelligent, maybe even sentient. And I think it was in hibernation until the mining activity disturbed it." "And the more comes soon part?" I asked, not really wanting the answer. She met my eyes, her expression grim. "I think it's not alone, or won't be for long." That night, our theory was confirmed in the worst possible way. 3 separate attacks occurred simultaneously in different parts of town. 3 creatures, not one. Witnesses described them as similar but not identical, 1 larger, 2 smaller, but all with the same basic appearance. "A family group," Dr. Webb theorized. The one from the mine and offspring, maybe? Or mates. Whatever they were coordinating their attacks, hunting with a terrible efficiency that left 7 more people dead or missing. The county commissioner finally requested state emergency assistance. The governor activated the National Guard. By morning, military trucks were rolling into Ely, setting up checkpoints and evacuation centers. Scientists from the CDC and other agencies arrived, talking about quarantine protocols and containment strategies. But I knew, as did Dr. Webb and Charlie, that conventional tactics wouldn't work against these creatures. They were too fast, too clever, too unlike anything we'd ever encountered. "We need to draw them out," I said during an emergency meeting at the high school. "All of them at once, into a place where we can trap them." "And how do you propose to do that?" a CDC official asked skeptically. I looked at Dr. Webb, who nodded slightly. "We'd discussed this already, a desperate plan with little chance of success." "They hunt by sound and smell," she explained. "We've observed them responding to certain frequencies, machinery, engines. And they're drawn to large groups," I added. "Maximum prey potential." Charlie, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. "The old copper processing plant. South edge of town, concrete walls 3 feet thick, limited access points. We rig it with speakers," Dr. Webb continued. "Broadcast the sounds that attract them, get them all inside. And then blow the whole damn place sky high," Charlie finished grimly. The officials looked horrified, but the local residents who'd seen the aftermath of the attacks nodded in grim agreement. This wasn't about capture or study anymore. This was about survival. By sunset, the plan was in motion. The copper plant had been rigged with explosives by an Army Corps of Engineers team. Speakers salvaged from the high school's audio system were strategically placed to broadcast the sounds Dr. Webb had determined would attract the creatures, a mix of industrial noise and biological sounds that made my skin crawl. Most of the remaining townsfolk had been evacuated. Only volunteers stayed. Myself, Dr. Webb, Charlie, and a squad of National Guardsmen who'd drawn the short straw. We were positioned on nearby buildings with night vision equipment and high-powered rifles. As darkness fell, Dr. Webb activated the speakers. The sound that filled the night was like nothing I'd ever heard. Screeching metal overlaid with something like whale song, punctuated by deep thrumming bass notes that I felt in my chest cavity. "Now we wait," she said over the radio, her voice tight with tension. We didn't have to wait long. Within an hour, the first creature appeared, emerging from a storm drain near the plant. It paused, head tilted, listening to the sounds. Then it moved toward the building with that strange, jerky grace. "Target 1 approaching the east entrance," reported a guardsman. "Hold fire," came the response from the command post. "Wait for the others." 10 minutes later, the second creature appeared, slightly smaller than the first, moving with the same unsettling gait. It circled the building once before entering through a broken window. "Target 2 is inside," reported another guardsman. "Still no sign of Target 3. We waited, tense, scanning the darkness. Minutes stretched into an hour. The third creature didn't appear. "Maybe there are only 2, suggested the guard commander. But Dr. Webb shook her head. "We confirmed 3 separate attack sites. There are 3 of them." That's when I realized our mistake. The creatures were intelligent. They'd learned from each encounter, adapted their tactics. What if they'd recognized the trap? I was about to voice this concern when Charlie's voice came over the radio, calm but urgent. "Movement on the roof of the processing plant. I think it's been there the whole time, watching us." All eyes turned to the roof. And there it was. The largest of the 3 creatures crouched near the edge, its glowing eyes fixed on our position. It knew. Somehow, it had understood our plan. Before anyone could react, it leaped from the roof, not toward the ground, but toward the building where Dr. Webb was stationed. I heard her scream over the radio, followed by gunfire. "Webb's in trouble," I shouted, already running toward her position. "Detonate now. Blow the plant." "But the other creatures," began the commander. "Now!" I screamed. The explosion ripped through the night, a fireball rising into the sky as the processing plant collapsed in on itself. The two creatures inside never had a chance. But the third, the one that mattered most, was still out there. I reached Dr. Webb's building, weapon ready, heart pounding in my chest. The door to the roof access had been torn off its hinges. I could hear sounds of struggle above. Taking a deep breath, I rushed up the stairs, emerging onto the rooftop just in time to see the creature standing over Dr. Webb's prone form. It turned to face me, those terrible orange eyes reflecting the flames from the destroyed plant, and it spoke, in a voice like gravel being crushed. "You are different." I raised my rifle, but couldn't pull the trigger, transfixed by the fact that this thing, this nightmare, was actually communicating. "What are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. The creature made that terrible laughing sound again. "Older than your kind, sleeping until the earth shakes us awake." "Us," I repeated, a new fear gripping me. "Many nests," it said, taking a step toward me. "Many waiting. Mining wakes us. Digging wakes us. We feed, we breed, we spread." It gestured toward the burning processing plant. "You kill my young, I kill you all." It lunged, faster than I could react. But before it reached me, a shot rang out. The creature staggered, orange blood spurting from a wound in its elongated head. Behind it, Dr. Webb had risen to her knees, a pistol clutched in her shaking hands. I didn't hesitate. I emptied my rifle into the creature's body, each impact driving it back a step. It shrieked, that bone-chilling sound of rage and pain, before toppling over the edge of the roof. By the time I reached the street, it was gone. A trail of orange blood leading to a storm drain, but no sign of the creature itself. Dr. Webb survived, though her injuries were severe. The town of Ely began the slow process of rebuilding, though many never returned. The official story blamed a gas leak for the explosion at the processing plant, and a previously undocumented predator species for the deaths. But we knew the truth, and we knew it wasn't over. 6 months after what the locals came to call the Ely incident, I was still in Nevada, but I'd moved to Carson City. I'd tried to put the nightmare behind me, taking a job with a larger insurance company, dating a nice woman who worked at the local library, pretending that life could be normal again. Dr. Webb had moved to Boulder, Colorado, accepting a research position that she said would give her access to equipment she needed. She didn't specify what research she was conducting, but I could guess. The creature's final words haunted us both. Many nests, many waiting. We stayed in touch, sharing information about similar incidents around the western United States. There weren't many. A disappearance in an Idaho mining town. Strange tracks found near an abandoned quarry in Arizona. But enough to establish a pattern. Always near places where humans had dug deep into the earth. Always in remote, sparsely populated areas. Then, on a cold November evening, my phone rang. It was Charlie, still tending bar at the Miners' Rest in Ely. "They found Jimmy's body," he said without preamble. "A group of hikers stumbled across it in a cave about 5 miles from the old mine. Medical examiner says he'd been dead at least 6 months." My blood ran cold. "But we already found Jimmy, at the mine entrance." Charlie's voice was grim. "Exactly. So whose body did we find that day?" I flew back to Ely the next morning. The town had changed. Fewer people, more boarded-up buildings, an air of defeat hanging over the place. The mine remained sealed, guarded now by a permanent BLM presence that locals said was less about safety and more about keeping people away from whatever might still be inside. Dr. Webb met me at the airport, her face thinner than I remembered, her eyes burning with the intensity of obsession. She'd brought files, dozens of them, collected over months of research. "It's happening in other places," she said, as we drove to the morgue to examine Jimmy's newly discovered remains. "Small incidents, isolated cases, nothing that would make national news. But they're increasing in frequency." "The creatures are spreading," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Or they were already there," she countered. "Hibernating, like ours said. Mining operations, fracking, deep well drilling, we're waking them up." At the morgue, the county's new medical examiner, a young man named Dr. Patel, showed us Jimmy's remains. They were skeletal, picked clean by scavengers, but the cause of death was clear. Massive trauma to the chest cavity, consistent with the claw marks we'd seen before. "And you're certain this is James Holbrook?" I asked. Dr. Patel nodded. "Dental records confirmed it. The interesting part is the isotope analysis." He pointed to some charts that meant nothing to me. "This individual died approximately 6 months ago, which matches the time frame of his disappearance." "Then who was the body we found at the mine entrance?" Dr. Webb asked. Dr. Patel hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "That's the puzzling part. The remains recovered 6 months ago were initially identified as Holbrook based on the personal effects found with the body: wallet, watch, clothing. But the actual remains..." He paused. "They weren't entirely human." We both stared at him. "What do you mean, not entirely human?" I finally asked. "The tissue samples showed anomalous DNA. The previous ME attributed it to contamination or decomposition, but I've reviewed the slides." He lowered his voice. "Whatever that body was, its genetic structure was fundamentally different from ours. Enhanced musculature, bone density far beyond human norms, cellular structures that don't match any known terrestrial organism." Dr. Webb and I exchanged looks. A terrible possibility was forming in my mind. "Where are those remains now?" Dr. Webb asked. "CDC took them. Said it was a potential new pathogen. That's the last I heard." Later, at the Miners' Rest, we shared our theory with Charlie. The bar was nearly empty, just a couple of locals nursing beers in the corner. "You're saying that first body, the one we thought was Jimmy, was actually one of those creatures?" Charlie looked skeptical. "It looked human enough to fool the coroner." "Because it was deliberately left for us to find," Dr. Webb explained. "Made to look human enough at first glance. It wanted us to find it, to bring it into town." "Like a Trojan horse," I added. "A way to infiltrate." Charlie's weathered face paled. "You think one of them is still here? In Ely?" I nodded slowly. "I think it's been here the whole time, watching, learning, maybe even breeding." The implications were staggering. If the creatures could disguise themselves as human, even imperfectly, they could be anywhere. Anyone who'd moved to town in the past 6 months could potentially be one of them. Dr. Webb laid out her research files on the bar. "I've been tracking unusual incidents across mining regions in the western states. Disappearances, livestock mutilations, strange sightings. They're spreading, Charlie, and they're getting better at hiding." "What about the one you shot?" Charlie asked. "The big one, on the roof?" "Never found," I reminded him. "It got away, wounded but alive." We spent the night reviewing Dr. Webb's files, looking for patterns, for weaknesses, for anything that might give us an edge. The creatures seemed vulnerable to high-caliber weapons, explosives, and possibly extreme heat, but they were also incredibly resilient and adaptable. "They're learning from each encounter," Dr. Webb observed. "The one that spoke to you, It had been observing us long enough to pick up language. It said mining wakes them, I recalled. What if they've been down there for thousands of years? Millions even? Some kind of prehistoric species that went underground to survive? Dr. Webb considered this. Or something that was never meant to be on the surface at all. An underground ecosystem we've barely begun to understand. The next day, we drove out to the sealed mine entrance. The BLM had erected a chain-link fence around the site, topped with barbed wire and warned with "Danger, keep out" signs. Two bored-looking guards sat in a small prefab building near the gate. We weren't planning to go inside. We just wanted to see if there was any sign that something had come out since the sealing. Dr. Webb parked her car on a ridge overlooking the site, and we studied it through binoculars. No obvious disturbances, she noted. But that doesn't mean much. There are probably dozens of ways out that we don't know about. Natural fissures, old ventilation shafts. I was about to suggest we leave when I noticed one of the guards behaving oddly. He'd stepped out of the prefab and was looking around furtively, as if making sure he wasn't observed. Then he walked to the edge of the sealed mine entrance and bent down, placing something on the ground. "Are you seeing this?" I asked, handing the binoculars to Dr. Webb. She watched for a moment, then sucked in a sharp breath. "He's feeding it, making an offering." Indeed, the guard had left what appeared to be a package wrapped in butcher paper, meat, most likely, near a small opening at the base of the sealed entrance. An opening that, according to official reports, shouldn't exist. "He's working with them," I whispered, though there was no way the guard could hear us from this distance. "Or for them." Dr. Webb's face hardened. "Or he is one of them." We retreated carefully, not wanting to be spotted. Back in town, we shared our discovery with Charlie, who looked increasingly alarmed. "So now they've got people helping them, or they're disguising themselves as people?" He shook his head. "How do we fight something like that?" It was a question I'd been asking myself for months. How do you combat an enemy that can hide among you? That can look like your neighbor, your co-worker, the new deputy sheriff? "We need to expose them," Dr. Webb said firmly. "Find a way to detect them, to tell them apart from humans." "And then what?" Charlie asked. "Even if we can identify them, how do we stop them?" "One at a time, if necessary," I said, a cold resolve settling over me. "However many there are." That night, I couldn't sleep. The motel room felt too small, too vulnerable. Every sound from outside, a car passing, a dog barking, the wind rattling the windows, seemed amplified, threatening. I kept thinking about what the creature had said on the rooftop. Many nests, many waiting. How many were there? Dozens? Hundreds? Thousands hibernating deep beneath the earth, waiting to be awakened by our endless drilling and digging? Around 3 a.m., my phone rang. It was Dr. Webb, her voice tense. "Come to my room, now, and be careful." I grabbed my gun and made my way across the motel courtyard to her room. She let me in quickly, locking the door behind me. Her laptop was open on the bed, displaying what looked like medical scans. "I've been reviewing the autopsy data from the creature we initially mistook for Jimmy," she explained. "Looking for physiological weaknesses, biological markers, anything we could use. And their body temperature runs significantly higher than ours, almost 108 degrees Fahrenheit. It would kill a human, but seems to be their normal state." She pulled up another image. "And look at this cranial structure. The brain cavity is nearly twice the size of a human's, with unusual development in areas associated with sensory processing. So they're smarter than us," I concluded grimly. "Different," she corrected. "Adapted for different conditions. But yes, possibly more intelligent in certain ways. And definitely more physically capable." She showed me more images. Enhanced musculature, reinforced bone structure, a digestive system capable of processing materials that would be toxic to humans. They're perfectly evolved predators, she said, and we're their ideal prey. Before I could respond, there was a knock at the door. We both froze, exchanging alarmed glances. It was the middle of the night. Who would be knocking? "Dr. Webb," came a voice from outside. "It's Deputy Lewis. We need to talk." Deputy Lewis was one of the new officers hired after Sheriff Daniel's death. I'd never met him, but Dr. Webb had mentioned him as being unusually interested in her research. Dr. Webb moved to the window, carefully pulling back the curtain to peek outside. Her face paled. "There are 3 of them," she whispered. "Lewis and 2 others I don't recognize." The knocking came again, more insistent. "Dr. Webb, please open the door. It's important." I drew my gun, motioning for Dr. Webb to stay back. "What do you want, Deputy?" I called. There was a pause, then, "Mr. Ashworth? We need to speak with both of you about the mine." Dr. Webb was hastily gathering her research files, shoving them into a backpack along with her laptop. She gestured toward the bathroom window, our only other exit. The knocking became pounding, the door shuddering in its frame. "Open the door now." We moved quickly to the bathroom, Dr. Webb climbing out first while I covered the door. I heard the wood begin to splinter. They were breaking it down. As I squeezed through the small window, I caught a glimpse of the door giving way. Deputy Lewis burst in, followed by 2 men in civilian clothes. But in the harsh motel lighting, their faces looked wrong, the proportions slightly off, the skin too tight over the bone structure. Their movements had that same unsettling, jerky quality I remembered from the mine. They weren't human. None of them were human. Dr. Webb and I ran for her car, bullets striking the pavement around us. I returned fire, hitting one of our pursuers in the chest. He staggered but didn't fall, orange blood seeping through his shirt. We made it to the car and sped away, tires screeching on the asphalt. In the rearview mirror, I could see them standing in the parking lot, watching us go, not chasing, almost as if they knew something we didn't. "They're infiltrating," Dr. Webb said, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Taking positions of authority. Lewis is a deputy sheriff, for God's sake." "Where are we going?" I asked, checking the ammunition in my gun. Only a few rounds left. "Charlie's," she replied. "We need to warn him, then get out of Eli. Take this to someone who can help. FBI, military, someone." But as we pulled up to Charlie's small house on the edge of town, we knew something was wrong. The front door stood open, swinging gently in the night breeze. A lamp had been knocked over in the living room, the bulb casting strange, elongated shadows across the walls. "Charlie?" I called, gun raised as we entered cautiously. There was no answer, just the oppressive silence of a house that had recently witnessed violence. In the kitchen, we found signs of a struggle. Broken dishes, a chair overturned, smears of blood on the linoleum floor. Charlie's shotgun lay on the floor, unfired. "They took him," Dr. Webb said, her voice breaking, "because he was helping us." I nodded grimly. "And they'll be coming back for us." We gathered what supplies we could find. Ammunition for my pistol, food, water, Charlie's spare truck keys. We needed to get out of Eli, to take what we knew to someone who could help. But as we stepped outside, we realized it might already be too late. Cars were converging on the house. Police cruisers, civilian vehicles, their headlights cutting through the darkness. I counted at least 5, containing perhaps a dozen people, or things that looked like people. "The back," I urged, pulling Dr. Webb toward Charlie's old pickup parked behind the house. We piled in, the engine roaring to life as the first of our pursuers reached the front yard. We took the back roads, avoiding the main highway where they would certainly have set up roadblocks. Dr. Webb navigated while I drove, both of us scanning the darkness for signs of pursuit. "Head for the old fire road through the Humboldt," she said, pointing to a barely visible track cutting through the sagebrush. "It connects to Highway 50 about 40 miles west. They might not think to cover it." The truck bounced and rattled over the rough terrain, the headlights illuminating just a few feet of the narrow dirt road ahead. Behind us, I could see distant headlights. They'd figured out our escape route. "They're coming," I warned, pushing the aging truck as fast as I dared on the treacherous road. Dr. Webb looked back, her face grim in the dashboard lights. "Dale, if they catch us..." "They won't," I cut her off, not wanting to consider the alternative. But deep down, I knew our chances were slim. These creatures had been hunting humans for who knows how long. They were faster, stronger, and now they had vehicles and weapons. And they were everywhere, disguised as the very people we might turn to for help. As we crested a ridge, I saw something that made my heart sink. More headlights ahead, coming toward us from the direction of Highway 50. They'd cut us off. "Hold on," I said, wrenching the wheel to the right, taking the truck off-road into the sagebrush. The undercarriage screamed in protest as we bounced over rocks and through shallow gullies. For a few minutes, it seemed like we might make it. The pursuing vehicles fell behind, unable to follow our erratic path through the desert scrub. But then the truck hit something hard, a hidden boulder or ditch, and the front axle snapped with a sound like a gunshot. We were stranded, miles from the highway, with unknown numbers of hostiles closing in from all sides. "We need to move on foot," I said, grabbing the backpack with Dr. Webb's research. "Head for those hills. The rocks will give us cover." We ran, stumbling through the darkness, the moonlight our only guide. Behind us, I could hear vehicles stopping, doors slamming, voices calling out. They were organizing a search party. We reached the rocky hills and began climbing, seeking a defensible position. The rough stone tore at our hands, but fear drove us upward, away from the creatures that hunted us. Halfway up, we found what we were looking for. A small cave, barely visible in the darkness, its entrance hidden behind a stand of juniper trees. We crawled inside, collapsing on the cool dirt floor, gasping for breath. "We can't stay here long," Dr. Webb whispered. "They'll search every inch of these hills by morning." I nodded, checking my gun. 3 rounds left. Not nearly enough. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the distant sounds of our pursuers organizing their search. Flashlight beams swept across the hillside below, probing the darkness for any sign of us. "Dale," Dr. Webb said finally, her voice soft but determined. "If we don't make it out of here, someone needs to know what we've learned." She pulled a small digital recorder from her pocket, the same model Sheriff Daniels had used. "I've been documenting everything. The creatures, their abilities, their weaknesses, the locations of possible nests. It's all here." She pressed it into my hand. "One of us has to get this out. To someone who can help." I understood what she was suggesting. A distraction. One of us would draw them away, giving the other a chance to escape with the evidence. "I'll go," I said immediately. "You take the research and the recorder, head west toward Highway 50. But she shook her head. "You're a better shot, and you've faced them before. You'll have a better chance of fighting them off." She managed a small smile. "Besides, I was on the track team in college. I'm faster." Before I could argue, she handed me the backpack and the recorder. "Wait until I've drawn them away, then go east. There's a ranger station about 15 miles that way. They'll have a radio, vehicles." "Eliza," I began, using her first name for perhaps the first time. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," she cut me off. "Because if we both stay here or try to run together, we'll both be caught. And then everything we know dies with us." She gripped my arm tightly. Promise me you'll get that information out, that you'll make people believe." I met her gaze in the darkness of the cave, seeing the determination there, the courage. I nodded slowly. "I promise." She hugged me briefly, then moved to the cave entrance, peering out at the searching flashlights below. "Give me 5 minutes, then go." And then she was gone, scrambling down the hillside, intentionally making noise to attract attention. I heard shouts as they spotted her, saw flashlight beams converge on her position. Then came the sound of running feet, crashing through the underbrush. The hunt was on. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The sounds of pursuit faded into the distance as Dr. Webb led them away from the cave, away from me and the vital information I carried. I waited until all was quiet, then slipped out of the cave and began moving east, using the stars to guide me. I walked through the night, my mind replaying everything we'd learned, everything we'd seen. The creature in the mine, speaking of many nests. The infiltrators taking human form. The spread of incidents across the western states. It was a nightmare beyond comprehension. An invasion so subtle, so insidious, that most people wouldn't realize what was happening until it was too late. As dawn broke over the Nevada desert, I reached the ranger station. It was small, just a cabin and a radio tower, but it represented safety, communication with the outside world. I approached cautiously, watching for any sign that they had reached here before me. The station appeared empty, the door locked. I broke a window to get inside, immediately heading for the radio. It was my lifeline, my only chance to warn the world about what was happening in Ely and perhaps in a dozen other small towns across the country. I set up Dr. Webb's laptop, plugging in the digital recorder, preparing to transmit everything we knew. As the equipment powered up, I gazed out the window at the rising sun. Somewhere out there, Dr. Webb was either still running or had been captured. Charlie was missing, possibly dead, and an ancient enemy was spreading, awakening from its long slumber beneath the earth, ready to reclaim the surface world from humanity. I keyed the microphone, took a deep breath, and began to speak. "This is Dale Ashworth, calling from Ranger Station 14 outside of Ely, Nevada. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I have evidence to support every word. 6 months ago, something emerged from an abandoned mine near Steptoe Creek. Something not human. Something that's been waiting beneath the earth for a very long time. And as I spoke, transmitting our findings to whoever might be listening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That glowing orange eyes were fixed on the ranger station, on me. That the creatures already knew what I was doing and were coming for me, even now. But it didn't matter. The truth was going out. And even if they got me, even if they got all of us, someone would hear. Someone would know. Someone would fight. Because if there's one thing I learned in Ely, it's that humanity isn't ready to surrender the surface world. Not to hunger, not to darkness, not to the things that wait below. Not without one hell of a fight.